Give a hand to our next speakers. Managing Director of Health at Robin Hood, Sarah Oltmans, moderating a panel with President of the Harlem Children's Zone, Geoff Canada, and Compton Foundation Centennial Professor for the Prevention of Children's and Youth Problems at Columbia University School of Social Work, Jane Waldfogel.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here today. We have with us Jane Waldfogel from the Columbia School of Social Work and Geoff Canada. So at Robin Hood, we know that moving out of poverty is difficult, but our data is also teaching us that staying out of poverty is part of the problem. In 2012, Robin Hood and Columbia created the Poverty Tracker in order to gain a deeper understanding of both the causes and the consequences of poverty in New York City. So we know from other surveys that at any given point in time, about 1 in 5 New Yorkers is living in poverty. But if we continue to follow those households year over year for a 3-year period, we see that more than 40% of those households will have a period of poverty, which Wes mentioned earlier. But the Poverty Tracker does more than just capture who's crossing the poverty line and when. It allows us to look at other factors like material hardships, which include not having enough money to feed your family or having your utilities shut off. It also looks at health conditions that might prevent somebody from working or push them into poverty. So today we're going to talk about what all of this data is telling us and how it's beginning to inform work being done on the ground in New York City to fight poverty every single day. With that, Jane and Geoff, let's jump in. So Jane, we're learning more about this work all the time, especially as we dive more deeply into how factors like race and gender impact a person's ability to exit poverty. How have poverty and hardships, like some of the ones I mentioned, running out of money for food or utilities or rent, changed since we launched the Poverty Tracker back in 2017?
So we now have several years of Poverty Tracker data. I think there's a slide that's going to go up on this side, that side, showing the trends in poverty. So there it goes. So we now have data that provides a snapshot of poverty going back to 2012. And so although poverty rates are higher in New York City than the rest of the nation, you can see that the light blue light blue line on the top is poverty in New York City. So poverty is higher in New York City than in the nation. You can see the good news is that poverty rates have been falling over time in New York City. So that's the good news. The not good news is that, of course, poverty continues to be higher in New York City than elsewhere, and there's a lot of disparity in New York City, as Sarah mentioned and as Wes mentioned in his opening, with higher rates by race, by age, by immigration status.
I want to touch on hardships a little bit there, too.
So a unique feature of the Poverty Tracker is that we don't just track income poverty using the best possible measure. So as Marta Tienda was mentioning in her opening remarks, there's an outdated poverty measure that's been used traditionally at the national level. We now use the supplemental poverty measure, which is the best possible measure. So this is really an accurate measure of poverty for New York City. But right from the beginning, Robin Hood wanted us to go beyond income poverty and also measure material hardship and also health and well-being in New York City. So we have a multi-dimensional measure. So we also track hardships. Are you running out of money to pay bills? Are you having to double up? Are you homeless? Are you running out of money for food? Real tangible hardships. Unfortunately, rates of hardship are even higher than rates of poverty. But those two have been declining over time. So it's another piece of good news.
And just one more thing before we move on to Geoff. I just wanted to touch on the exiting poverty and what we see there.
So as Marta was saying in her opening, we used to think just about poverty in the snapshot. And then Mary Jo Bain and David Elwood, who were my advisors in graduate school, revolutionized the field by thinking about poverty dynamics. And so we also capture dynamics with the Robin Hood Poverty Tracker. So we follow the same New Yorkers over a period of years so we can follow them as they move into or hopefully out of poverty. So this last year, Robin Hood asked us to really focus in on what does it take to be sustainably out of poverty, not just who's moving out of poverty temporarily, but who stays out of poverty. And is there an income threshold at which you're up and out of poverty in a sustainable fashion? And the results were really striking. So you can see if you're in poverty, the chances of staying in poverty, as Wes was saying this morning, poverty's sticky. The chances of staying in poverty are unfortunately quite high. Conversely, once you get out of poverty, especially if you get up and above 200% of poverty, your chances of falling back in really are greatly diminished. So there's a really clear message here. It's not just enough to get out of poverty, just above the poverty line, but really if you can get above 200% of poverty, your chances are much greater of staying out sustainably. So that's a really important message for us.
Great. Thanks for that, Jane, setting the framework there. So I know that we all are aware of the fact that data is only part of the equation, that we also need to hear from people doing the work on the ground and voices in the community. Geoff, how does this data track with what you're seeing in your work in Harlem and across other neighborhoods in New York City?
Well, I think I'm seeing some of the same challenges that many people in this room are facing. You've got a good news story in aggregate as things have gotten better. But here's the bad news. New York City is so large that we're not talking about a small number of folks who are still struggling in poverty. Our poverty numbers are larger than many cities in this country. So this is a huge issue that we're facing. And I don't want people to get sort of overly optimistic by looking at some of the downward trends, right? Because the numbers are so large. And we've got some other challenges. You know, Great Harlem looks so much better, but you know what the rents are now in that community? It's just unbelievable. So much of our city is unaffordable right now, and I know Daniel was talking about what's going on in San Francisco and Seattle. Well, guess what? You look at the numbers of homeless here in this city, it is just staggering, and it impacts children at very large numbers. I know that one of our good friends from Fortune was talking about the incarceration rates. What's happened in these communities, in particular to men of color, around stop and frisk and the huge numbers of folks who've been sent into that system. And one of the things I was going to ask Raj, everybody had questions for Raj, but I was hoping to ask him because, you know, the thing about jails and prisons and juvenile detentions, they're the opposite of school. They're the opposite of places that teach you how to cope in a way that's going to be productive. When you funnel huge numbers of people into that system, you're going to have long-lasting impact on their lives. And we've had this experiment here in New York City where we sent literally millions of folks into those systems. And I know it impacts people for the rest of their life. So while it is great that we're seeing these numbers and we should feel good about them, we should also remember Raj's charts, those very dark red places where we're seeing very little movement from mobility. And we have to realize in New York City, unlike in other places, and unlike Seattle, these are huge numbers of folks who are trapped in those places, and we need to kind of redouble our efforts in those areas.
Those are all great points, and I think probably resonate with many of the people doing the work on the ground in this room here.
At least two of them.
Yeah. In 2018, we added our Hope and Opportunity module to the Poverty Tracker. And so for the first time, we have comprehensive data on how New Yorkers view hope and whether they have hope, and how they think about opportunity for both themselves and their children. Jane, what gave you hope when you looked at this research, and was there anything that gave you cause for concern or that surprised you?
You know, New Yorkers are not naive. So what we heard from New Yorkers is they don't necessarily think the system is fair. They know that certain people get ahead more than other people. On the one hand, they said getting ahead, it's important if you work hard, if you get a good education, but it also matters who you know. So New Yorkers are not naive, and this was no surprise. I think what did surprise us was the level of hope and optimism that individual New Yorkers had about their own prospects. You know, despite the cynicism about what it takes to get ahead and about the system being rigged against particular groups or about people overall, there was a lot of hope and optimism about getting ahead yourself. And the more so, the more disadvantaged the groups were, the more likely they were to feel optimistic and feel hopeful when asked about, what about you? Are you hopeful that you're going to get ahead? So that's a really great message in terms of mobility, that if we think people are despairing or disengaged, that's not the case in New York City.
Yeah, and I know we have two slides here to go into a little bit more detail on that and how people were really kind of breaking down both by race and ethnicity and education level, as well as by their poverty status. Can you give us a little more insight on that?
Sure. So what you can see if you look at the graph over here is that although New Yorkers were optimistic overall when asked about their own situation, the most optimistic New Yorkers were Black or Hispanic New Yorkers and those who were living in poverty. So, and people who were less educated. So the groups that were really most at risk were at the same time the most optimistic.
Yeah, which I think was somewhat counterintuitive. I think going in, and I think we all found really interesting.
Yeah.
So Geoff, how does data like this inform program design and delivery at a place like Harlem Children's Zone?
Well, I think one of the things that we should all be looking at is whether or not the data conforms with our sort of views, because often you have a certain view of a place and you look at data and realize that view was really not informed by data. I think on this issue of hope in this community, the thing that's so different from New York City and a lot of places I go to, which have large numbers of folks who are trapped in poverty, if it's Detroit or Chicago or some of these other places, is the sort of development of our not-for-profit sector here that's targeted on these populations is something really extraordinary. The numbers of talented people who have dedicated their lives to trying to keep pushing up against these issues. And if you've been in this business as long as I have, and there are a few of us around who go back into the 80s, you know that there's one crisis after the other. We went through the crack epidemic and the homicide epidemic, and then the employment and homelessness and all of the sort of chaos that New York City sort of was going through as you go through the different decades. And in each time, there were groups that stood up for that challenge and kept trying to make this city a better place for everybody. And I just think that a lot of the hope that New Yorkers feel, and particularly in these minority communities, are based on a lot of the work that people here have done in those communities, saying to people, don't give up, we're going to be here to help you. And we haven't had places that are totally isolated from support the way I find in some other cities.
So turning to the idea of solutions, many of us in this room have seen or read the reports that unemployment is down across the U.S. And in New York City, it's at its lowest levels on record at less than 4%. So what does that mean if we have all of these people working, but there are still such high rates of poverty and hardship? How do we actually find solutions, especially when costs might be going up for people and housing is scarce?
So one of the clearest findings from the poverty tracker is that work on its own is not enough to bring people out of poverty. So when we look at the adults in New York who are poor, more than half of them are working. So work is not a solution for them. When we look at the adults who are in hardship, more than 60% of them are working. So work alone is not going to be enough. And what we hear really clearly from the respondents is they're looking for more work. They're looking for more hours. They're looking for more jobs. They're looking for more weeks. The story that Wes started out with this morning about his mother working multiple jobs to patch together a living is still true today. And maybe with the added twist that earnings are changing week to week as jobs are more precarious and schedules are shifting from week to week in an unpredictable fashion. And then, of course, wages are low. So it's not just a question of work, but of quality work where there are enough hours and enough pay.
Yeah, and I think there's, there's a political aspect to this also. We heard that the poorest communities may not benefit from an Amazon moving into Queens. Well, why is that? Why shouldn't we be really thinking about how to make sure when opportunity happens, it's not like those maps where you keep sending poor people into poor communities where they aren't able to access opportunity. We really need to start thinking about how we provide a large number of New Yorkers with a set of skills that will allow them to earn higher wages. That's going to take a real investment. And it's funny because You know, one of the things that's happened is people think we've made these investments in these communities around poverty and it hasn't worked, right? So they don't want to do the investments. We really do have evidence that some of these investments really pay off. And I think we need to begin to really push large investments in. You're right. Having, you know, really poor people, often single mothers, trying to juggle 2 or 3 part-time jobs, having a full-time job and still working part-time, and you've got kids at home, you're just guaranteeing the next generation is going to remain poor, right? So we've got to be thinking, I think, more ambitious. And I think that some of us who have decided, well, you know, there's not enough resources to tackle some of these big issues, I think we're going to have to think differently. We've got to invest the resources if we plan to hope that we're going to help these people. Because I've got some, you know, this is kind of optimistic, but I've got some real pessimistic news. This is as good as it gets. We've got the lowest unemployment. We've had the longest run of a boom market. It is not going to last. And we know the last hired are the first fired. We know that. So I think we've got to take this opportunity right now to start thinking about how do we create some real opportunities for these families so that they can continue to compete in what I think is going to become a much more competitive environment in terms of high quality jobs.
Great. I think that that is a great moment to actually turn it to the audience. I know that many people may have questions for Geoff and Jane.
Good morning. My name is Ira Yankwin. I'm the executive director of the Literacy Assistance Center, and we have 2.2 million adults in New York City who lack English language proficiency or a high school diploma. And I'm wondering to what extent you see investment in adult literacy programming as part of the answer. I've noticed that hasn't been part of the discussion so far this morning.
It's a really good point. I mean, as Geoff was saying, we have to think about poverty not just for the current generation, but intergenerationally, and what investments do kids need if they're going to grow up and move out of poverty. And parental education is one of the strongest predictors. And what's getting inside parental education? It's comfort with the education system, but it's also literacy skills. So you're absolutely right. We have such a shameful record in this country of young people who come out of school unable to read and not numerate. And, you know, it's a scandal. There's no other country that has such a poor record, and we have to do something about it.
And I would just say on that issue, you know, we have these really high-quality programs in New York City that we know really work, but we don't scale them, right? We don't really look at the size of the problem and say, wow, based on the size of this problem, we really need to invest X if we're going to solve this. And I think we're going to just, this kind of data, we have to use this kind of data to say to both folks in philanthropy, as well as in business, as well as in politics, that we've got to come up with solutions that match the scale of the problem, because just creating another, you know, wonderful literacy program for 47 people or 120 people in the Bronx or Brooklyn is really not going to provide the level of skills we're going to need to really move the needle.
There's one back there too, Anna.
Hi, Donna Butts with Generations United.
And just one moment, we'll grab you the microphone.
Hi, Donna Butts with Generations United. I really appreciate all of the comments today, but what I haven't heard anybody talk about going from a 2-gen to a 3-gen to a 4-generation strategy, and the role of grandparents and other relatives raising children, extended family members, multi-generational households, and that importance of making sure that we have that entire family and extended family involved. So I wondered if you could address that.
Why don't I just start? And the question was sort of this multi-generational approach. And it's something that, you know, we really believe in, and there are a number of folks I know who represent organizations that work with parents, grandparents, children, all at the same time. The challenge, I think, with the comprehensive approach is that, again, you're going to see I'm beating this sort of dead horse now. It is when you start dealing with that kind of complexity, you really have to provide a range of services, and most folks are forced with, I'll provide a range of services and serve less people, right? Because I don't have the money to scale it. Or I'll serve more people, but I'll target in on just, the children, and I don't really have the resources for the parents. Again, I think the evidence shows us that that's not the most effective way to working with people who are trapped in poverty. You need this more comprehensive approach. And that requires a secondary look at the way we support these kinds of programs. Because I think people understand it. I think they're making logical choices based on the resources they have to deploy towards some of these issues.
And I'll just add one point to that. We had a great conversation earlier this year with Marta Tienda, and she encouraged us as an organization to think about households so that we could really think about all the different people who are impacting a child's life and really understand that that's part of what we need to be looking at. I think we have time for one more question.
I think Anna back there. Anna back there has been. There's one back there. Anna.
Right. Yep.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your panel and the whole day. Several of you on this panel talked about quality jobs, and I really appreciate that you've brought job quality policy into the discussion. And something just occurred to me based on, James, one of the data points you said about people needing to achieve 200% or above of the poverty level in order to stay out of poverty. I know that there's several people in this room who have worked on like self-sufficiency standards to figure out what a living wage is. But I'm wondering if there might be a mobility standard that says what is the package of a quality job in terms of wages and benefits that you get from an employer, plus what you might get through, let's say, the ACA or Medicaid expansion or subsidized childcare, et cetera, to get you to that threshold above which you're less likely to fall back into poverty. And it's just, I'm just curious what you would think about an idea like that.
I think that's a great idea, and we would love to do it. So yeah, I think I was thinking the same thing. We've sort of moved from minimum wages to living wages, but we haven't really talked about mobility wages and what's the package. And we do a lot of work at Columbia on income packages and thinking about packaging various income sources and benefits. But we haven't done that specifically around this 200% threshold. So I think, the last few years, honestly, we've been focused more on deep poverty and poverty because of the political climate that we've been in. So, but we're looking forward to being a bit more forward-looking and thinking about more expansive policies, like policies that would get us to 200% of poverty. So that's a great idea.
So I think that's a great place for us to end. Thank you, Geoff and Jane, for your time today and also your wonderful partnership with Robin Hood over the years.
Thank you.